Okay, so we're good to go. And so thank you all. For everybody watching, good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today. So we're good to go. And sorry, let me mute this here. Okay. So yeah, thank you for joining us. My name is Muhammad Muhammad. I'm the executive director here at the Jerusalem Fund and Palestine Center. And as always, we're delighted to have you all here virtually. And today we are very happy to host Dr. Ramzi Baroud and Dr. Trita Parsi, who will be discussing and analyzing the normalization deal between Israel, the UAE, Bahrain, and the US. And we're happy to also have Mr. Saeed Arakat here, who is on our Palestine Center committee, and also the Washington Bureau Chief for the Al-Quds Daily, and he will be moderating this, this session. So thank you all for joining us. We really appreciate it. So just a little bit about our speakers today. Dr. Ramzi Baroud is a journalist and the editor of the Palestine Chronicle. He's the author of 5 books on Palestine, including My Father Was a Freedom Fighter, The Last Earth, and his latest book, These Chains Will Be Broken, Palestinian Stories of Struggle and Defiance in Israeli Prisons. Dr. Baroud is a non-resident senior research fellow at the Center for Islam and Global Affairs, as well as Istanbul Zaim University, and at the Johannesburg-based Afro-Middle East Center. And to learn more about him, his website is www.ramzibaroud, and that's RAMZYBAROUD.net. Dr. Trita Parsi is an award-winning author and the 2010 recipient of the Grawemeyer Award for Ideas Improving World Order. He is the executive vice president of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft and an expert on U.S.-Iranian relations, Iranian foreign politics and the geopolitics of the Middle East. He is the author of Treacherous Alliance, The Secret Dealings of Iran, Israel, and the United States, for which he conducted more than 130 interviews with senior Israeli, Iranian, and American decision makers. Dr. Parsi's articles on Middle East affairs have been published in the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, the Financial Times, Jane's Intelligence Review, The Nation, the American Conservative, the Jerusalem Post, the Forward, and others. And he is also a frequent guest on CNN, PBS's NewsHour, NPR, the BBC, and Al Jazeera. So without further ado, I will pass it along to our speakers and our moderator.
Yes.
And I guess whoever wants to go first can start.
Well, can I just welcome both Dr. Baroud and Dr. Parsi, Muhammad. I just want to, thank them for doing this, and please go ahead. Thank you.
Dr. Baroud, why don't you start?
Thank you. I'm just gonna speak for only a few minutes about my take on the issue. But before I do so, just would like to thank very much the Jerusalem Fund, my friend Muhammad, Mr. Erikat, and all the people at the organization for all their dedication and hard work. And it's an honor to be with you, Dr. Parsi, in this forum.
Thank you.
I think it's important that we kind of really decide what is the timeline for this discussion. I mean, we've been talking a lot about how there's been various types of secret dealings between, Gulf Arab countries, United Arab Emirates in particular, Bahrain to a lesser extent, even Oman, even Qatar at one point, and Saudi Arabia and so forth in recent years. And the idea here is that Palestine has been betrayed by these countries, and I'm not of course contending with that idea. In fact, there is a great deal of betrayal happening. But I think beyond the cliches, I think there is something a little bit more serious going on here, and that is I think that the very Palestinian idea has been betrayed by the Palestinian leadership, by the Arab governments, by the Arab League, which has been rather marginal in all of this for many years. And I think really the proper starting point of normalizing Israel was Oslo, and even before Oslo, of how the political discourse itself began shifting. And the new language was the language that was dictated not necessarily by the international community as in international law and UN resolutions and so forth and so on, but rather by Washington and the Washington Consensus in particular. So there was this new language that was imposed on the discourse, one that speaks of a peace process, painful compromises, negotiation tables, land, for peace formula or peace for land formula, whatever. This has been taking place for such a long time, and during this time, the idea of Israel has been normalized within the space of Arab elites, Arab intellectuals, Arab policymakers and governments and so forth. And the Palestinian leadership itself has played a major part in the normalization of Israel in these forums. When you have, for example, the Palestinian Authority attending all sorts of conferences and forums pertaining to the environment and pertaining to music and art and sports and all of this, in which it works hand in hand with Israel and it coordinates with Israel, it was no longer a sin. At one point we struggled with even using the word Israel, and because a lot of people refer to it as the Zionist entity. And then when people began using the word Israel so very hesitantly so, that created a controversy to one point. And then when the Israelis began showing up on Al Jazeera and Al Arabiya and other Arab news platforms, it was also a bit of a puzzler. What's happening? Why is Israel being normalized? And reaching this point where the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain and others, including Sudan, will soon be joining this train of normalization, I don't find it neither shocking in any way or a betrayal of the Palestinian leadership. Maybe the betrayal of the Palestinian people and the Palestinian cause, but certainly not of the Palestinian leadership that itself has been involved in the normalizing of Israel as an idea, as a government, as a policy. One just very quick last thing I'd like to say is that the Arab Spring could have really helped, or the so-called Arab Spring could have really kind of pushed us one way or the other. If the democratic movements in the Arab world prevailed, I think it would have been certainly a boost to the Palestinian cause, but sadly they didn't. And as a result, Palestine was also marginalized further. I mean, right now we are anticipating protests next Friday in Egypt. The Libyans are concerned with their own conflicts and their own peace deals, the same situation with Yemen, in Syria and elsewhere. And that kind of provided a lot of political space and a great opportunity for Arab regimes that were eager to normalize with Israel, because they have already normalized with Israel through not only through secret meetings, but being part of the anti-Iran camp. We've seen what happened in Warsaw last year when the Arabs met and they decided that Iran is the enemy, but they met under the auspices of the United States, Jared Kushner namely, and Israel. So really the idea of the Arabs, why are they normalizing now and so forth, it's not a proper question. I think Arabs have already normalized with Israel. They are already part of the American camp. Maybe the question is why now, why not 2-3 years ago and so forth. But to argue that this is something really new and explosive news that requires a great deal of analysis, I don't think it's proper. I think normalization has begun many years ago, and I think it was the rational outcome of this trajectory of defeat and normalization that has been that the Arabs have experienced in the last 10, if not 20 years.
Okay. Well, thank you, Dr. Baroud. Dr. Parsi?
Thank you. Let me first echo Dr. Baroud in thanking you all for organizing this and for inviting me to be here. to participate in this conversation. I thought those comments were very interesting. I will also just say a couple of words, but I would just like to briefly make one point in regards to what Dr. Baroud was saying. I think it is quite fair to point out that this is a process that started quite some time ago, and to suddenly be surprised indicates of not really following things very closely. However, I think it's important to make a distinction between the normalizing of Israel and the normalizing of the occupation. What this seems to be doing more than anything else is the normalization of the occupation. The normalization of Israel has already taken place much earlier, as you mentioned. The two, whether they're inevitable in the sense that accepting Israel would mean that there would be an acceptance of the occupation, I think is worthy of discussion. I would like to make a couple of comments in regards to what the deeper geopolitical meaning of all of this may be. The Trump administration, of course, have been presenting this as if this is a peace deal, which is on its face quite laughable. Two countries that never were at war apparently made peace, and all of Washington is applauding. That is not what this is in any way, shape, or form. But the other thing that often also has accompanied this, which also Dr. Baroud made a reference to, that this is some form of an anti-Iran alliance. I think on the surface, absolutely, it does give that impression. And I'm not denying that there is that element there. But I think there's something else that is taking place that is more important than that. That is not to say that many of these countries do not view Iran as a threat, nor is it to deny that many of them have a degree of justification of being concerned about Iran. But it is to say that what is really bringing them together is, in my assessment, not some form of a sense of a dire, almost existential threat from Iran. In fact, just take a look at the UAE that started this. If the UAE's concern about Iran is at that level, that it would cause it to do what Netanyahu himself at the UN said was unimaginable a couple of years ago, meaning this threat from Iran is so massive that the UAE was willing to do things that it could not even consider earlier on, then one would expect that much of the UAE's foreign policy throughout the region would adjust accordingly. It would have a laser sharp focus on Iran and would build coalitions around that. When you actually take a look at the UAE's foreign policy, you see a very different reality. If there's any threat that the UAE seems to be organizing around, real or not real, it seems to be a combination of Turkey, the Islamic Brotherhood, and Qatar. Whether it is engaged directly vis-a-vis Qatar, or whether it's engagement in the Sinai, its engagement in Libya, for instance, it does not accompany this idea that it's so focused on Iran, because if it's so focused on Iran, why is it wasting its resources in Libya, for instance, where Iran has no presence whatsoever? Iran seems to more be the type of convenient pretext. Again, I don't want to deny that there is an element of threat there, but there's a highly exaggerated threat in order to be able to justify things that it otherwise would have difficulty doing. What does seem to be a common threat for both Israel, Riyadh, and Abu Dhabi is not so much Iran as it is the fear of the United States leaving the Middle East militarily. We have seen clear trends that the American public is very tired. They want to bring the troops home from Iraq, from Syria, an orientation that is much more about non-intervention rather than being the military hegemon in the region. Imagine the changes that would take place geopolitically under those circumstances. I think Israel would continue to be a very strong country as it is right now because of its military, and it's because of its own investment in self-reliance. But countries such as the UAE that have massive ambitions, or Riyadh or Saudi Arabia, their influence and extension and their reach in the region is very much a function of their proximity to Washington politically and Washington's willingness to serve as a military dominant power in the Middle East. You take that out and they lose a tremendous amount of their geopolitical weight and their geopolitical maneuverability. Iran is the most effective tool to be able to try to convince the United States to remain in the region, despite of the public opinion, both amongst Republicans and Democrats, to bring troops home and disengage militarily from the region. And in fact, it took only a couple of days and we saw that rather than the UAE pressing for a halt or even a reversal of annexation, what it really was about is that the UAE would be able to buy F-35s. Moreover, we now also see that conversations have been had between the Trump administration and the UAE, in which Abu Dhabi has been pressing the US to move on its major military bases from Turkey to the UAE. Now, what is all of this about? Well, a country like UAE hardly needs F-35s. Who would it really be able to effectively use it against? It has, however, as has many countries in the GCC, used military arms purchases from the United States as an alternative, as a proxy defense pact with the United States. If you buy F-35s, whether you like it or not, whether it's explicit or not, it does tend to obligate the United States to come to the UAE's defense militarily. If you move a military base to the UAE, certainly the United States would develop a significant incentive to defend the UAE militarily. So this to me seems to be much more about preventing the United States from doing what the American publicly in poll after poll after poll want the US to do, which is to pull out troops from the Middle East, but rather try to find new ways to tie the United States to the security and the geopolitical ambitions of countries such as the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Israel, who have this very strong commonality that as US partners, they need the United States to remain there militarily in order for them to be able to benefit from the geopolitical largesse of the United States. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Okay, excellent. Can you hear me all? Okay. Okay, enlightening, definitely statements by both of you. I want to begin with you, Dr. Baroud. Now you're saying, why now? Why now? Does that mesh with what Dr. Parsi just said, that, maybe they feel that the US is leaving and therefore there is some sort of a rush feeling to go ahead and do it now before something could happen? Or because I agree with the notion that the UAE will not likely be able to use these F-35s or have cause to use it. So why, in your view, now? I mean, what is the rush? What is the urgency?
Right. So yes, of course, I think part of it is that, but I think that only answers part of the question. And the reason that it doesn't answer the question is in full is that the pivot to Asia began under the presidency of Barack Obama, not under that of Donald Trump. This idea of, let's move elsewhere. The Middle East is just no longer, kind of serving American geopolitical interests, in the sense that we are really not getting what we want out of this, and we are wasting time, money, resources, and definitely thousands of soldiers getting killed there, while China is making a massive move throughout the Pacific, especially in the South China and the East China Seas. And as a result, the US needs to recalibrate its policies, and they need to achieve eventually a complete paradigm shift. So this has been going on for years. So the question again is, why now, if this began in 2012? And I think it's why now is because back to what Dr. Parsi had said, is that we have never seen a great game in the Middle East as massive as the one that we are seeing at the moment. The fact that the US began moving out of the Middle East slowly, and we have seen that in action, really, I think the best example was Libya. When NATO was calling on the US to make the first move, it turned out that the US wasn't ready for that. And again, it was under the Obama administration that they invented this term, leading from behind, allowing countries like Italy, like France, like Britain, to make their own moves in Libya and to try to deal with the situation. And we saw what happened at the end. Right now, NATO members, including Italy and France, are actually at odds in Libya because of the US not being able to play its traditional role of determining the policy and kind of imposing its will on NATO and on everyone else. But because of this vacuum, this space that was created by the rapid American withdrawal and disinterest in the region, growing disinterest in the region, we began seeing countries that would have never dared to make geopolitical claims, like Turkey, for example, making massive moves and taking serious steps in the East Mediterranean, for example, claiming certain parts of the Mediterranean that traditionally has been determined by NATO and NATO allies only. So we are seeing these camps all moving at the same time. You have Russia moving in slowly, first in Syria and then eventually in Libya and then elsewhere. At one point, they hosted a meeting between Hamas and Fatah in Moscow. It means that Russia is quite serious. This is not about protecting our military base in Tartus. It's no longer about that anymore. It's about Russia wanting to be a major player in the region. And a major player means that Iran, Hezbollah, Syria, of course, Turkey and others are now have to all make their moves and to create and to be part of new alliances. And that, back to what has been said earlier, that leaves United Arab Emirates, a city-state, basically helpless. Where is the protection of the United States? Who is going to come to our aid if we experience another, Saddam Hussein-like invasion as we have, as Kuwait had in the past? And as a result, these countries are now looking for new allies. They are weak countries. They are militarily defenseless countries, but they are very useful financially, economically, and from a geopolitical point of view. And as we know, United Arab Emirates in particular has its fingers in every pie, from Yemen to Libya, even to Mali and Sudan, of course, right. and Syria and elsewhere. So this is why Israel finds them to be quite important allies. Their proximity to Iran is particularly interesting for Israel. And this is why, in my opinion, is that the need to create a new camp that does no longer count on the power and the protection of the United States.
Dr. Parsi, I want to remain focused on the implications for the Palestinians and what they ought to do, the strategy forward. But I wanted to ask you, because you raised something very intriguing. You said they don't need the F-35s. They need some sort of an umbilical cord with the United States to keep them tied to their defense and so on. But there are no signs that the United States is really leaving the region in that sense, like stock and barrel. And we have the largest military naval base in Bahrain. You have large Air Force bases in Abu Dhabi itself, the largest F-18, in fact, base in Abu Dhabi. You have large American bases in Qatar, and in Kuwait and other places. There are no signs that they are leaving anytime soon. So why is this now, this urgency to do this? And in fact, even if it happened, one does not imagine that Israel would come and replace the United States. So I'd like your take on that.
I think you raise an excellent point. And indeed, the United States is, in my view, in a state of indecision and confusion at this point. On the one hand, the political signals are clearly in the direction we want to leave. The evidence on the ground is much more confusing. In some places in Iraq right now, for instance, there's been a large number of bases that have now been handed back over to the Iraqis. And in Afghanistan, you are seeing a reduction, and I think the Trump administration would like to go all the way down to zero. But elsewhere, you're seeing the complete contradiction. I think what you have is in the United States that actually has not made up its mind. Does it want to have and sustain Pax Americana in the Middle East, or does it not? There are arguments as to why the cost is immense, why the strategic value is very little, and as a result, the United States should be leaving. But there is that hesitance because of this fear, I think, more than anything else, that the United States would be giving up control. My question is, control of what? What is it that the United States actually successfully controls in the region right now that would make it worthwhile? So going to your question, yes, There are evidence that the US is not leaving, there are evidence that the US is leaving. But what has happened is that the US's willingness and eagerness to intervene militarily on behalf of the UAE and Saudi Arabia has changed. We saw that clearly last year when there were attacks against tankers, most likely from Iran, when there were attacks against oil fields in Saudi Arabia. And where was the Carter Doctrine? The Carter Doctrine says that the United States should be protecting these things. And Trump instead made it clear, I'm not going to go to war with Iran on your behalf. Immediately after that, two very interesting things happened. The UAE began its own negotiations with the Iranians, quite openly, sending emissaries there. The US was not very happy. The Saudis didn't do it publicly, but apparently through the Iraqi government, they did pursue a new dialogue with the Iranians. In fact, according to the Iraqi prime minister at the time, Qasem Soleimani was in Baghdad, handing over a message to the Iraqis for them to send to the Saudis, which was a response to a Saudi letter that the Iranians had received from the Iraqis. That was put to a stop with his assassination. But the reason why that was very interesting in of itself is the UAE and the Saudis have had plenty of opportunities to engage diplomatically with Iran. They have had little incentive to do so as long as they thought that they could rely on American power to balance Iran. The choice between relying on the US to handle the problem for them or to go to the negotiating table and have to agree to compromises, clearly they preferred relying on the US. When the US was not reliable, as it wasn't last summer, the UAE and the Saudis both were left with no choice but to rediscover the value of diplomacy. But as they did so, it seems like a new intensification of dialogue between the UAE and Saudi, Israel, and the United States took place, in which the US itself did not seem to be particularly eager to see the UAE starting to undermine America's maximum pressure strategy on Iran. And a new constellation, some sort of a new agreement was needed to be found of how can then the United States come back in and restore the Carter Doctrine so that the UAE can feel that it has the support of the United States. Well, the price of it appears to have been, at least according to Jared Kushner, normalization with Israel. And that's where we are today.
Okay, Dr. Baroud, I want to ask about the implications for the Palestinians. I mean, we are likely to have an announcement that Sudan is normalizing with Israel, probably as early as soon as tomorrow or maybe next week and so on. So what we are seeing is just like the domino effect right there, of normalizing with Israel. Now, the Palestinians have reacted. They withdrew their ambassadors from UAE, from Bahrain. They'll probably do it from Sudan. So are we seeing a shift in alliances where actually the Arab countries taking the side in a way? I mean, by taking the side of Israel and the Palestinians are becoming more isolated.
Right. I think to look at this question differently, let's try to understand what were the Palestinians receiving from these countries in terms of support and aid and whatever other perks that allowed them to sustain their struggle and resistance against Israel. From Bahrain, from United Arab Emirates, from Sudan, very, very little actually. The Palestinian Authority and the Palestinian leadership have had political struggles with the United Arab Emirates for years because of the hosting of Mohammed Dahlan, who is the arch enemy of Mahmoud Abbas, and so forth. So really, what will Palestinians lose as a result of this? I think very little. I don't think it's really going to fundamentally shift the nature of Palestinian struggle or the nature of support that Palestinians are receiving from these specific Arab countries, or frankly from the whole Arab League. And I know I'm kind of sounding a little bit too cynical here, but it's the truth. The Arab world has for many years become so, their support of Palestine has become so intangible, and they've grown so indifferent about it. To the point that whether that support exists or it doesn't exist at a political or verbal or sense in terms of statements made by the Arab League and Arab governments, it actually ultimately doesn't matter, because it actually hasn't mattered for such a long time. But I think there's a silver lining in all of this. And that is, I grew up in a refugee camp in Gaza, and I remember every single time Israel would have attacked Palestinians in this village or this mosque or this church, we immediately kind of, would look into the Arab world. What will the Arabs do? And then there's this emergency summit by the Arab League, waiting and desperately waiting for answer and desperately waiting for a collective Arab retort, one that never really came. And I don't think with time, the Palestinian leadership was really convinced that going to Cairo or to Baghdad or to Tunisia or wherever they were going to ask for Arab support actually made any difference. I think it became like more of a political protocol, a way to diffuse the anger of the people. The Arabs seems to be strong in their solidarity and support of Palestine. They pledged a little bit of money here and there. Most of it was never delivered. And the anger and the frustration of Palestinians are diffused slowly until the next Israeli attack, the next Israeli massacre, the next Israeli invasion, and so forth and so on. Now that the Arab League has betrayed Palestine and has turned its back entirely on the Palestinian cause, as we have seen in the recent summit in Cairo, what will the Palestinian leadership do next? What kind of solidarity or fake solidarity will they be able to garner in the next Israeli attack on Gaza? I think what this might have helped actually, and here's the positive spin on it, is that this is going to impose a new political conditions on the Palestinian leadership, that their new alliances and their new political outlook has to be based clearly on solidarity, real tangible solidarity of the Palestinian people. They have no other option now but to avoid these kind of nonsensical meetings in which final statements of solidarity written for Palestine that never really translate to anything. And maybe it is time to expand the political horizon beyond the Arab League and few Arab countries in the Gulf, especially the ones with the money, and to go somewhere else, back to Africa, Southeast Asia, South America, and so forth, where solidarity for the Palestinian people has existed for such a long time. And there's a lot that can be said about this kind of alternative solidarities. I've written a lot about Benjamin Netanyahu's particular quests to break down the solidarity that Palestine has in Africa and South America in particular, and to create a new type of solidarity around Israeli economic assistance and security aid and so forth and so on. I think it's maybe time for the Palestinian Authority to think around the same lines. Instead of chasing after the United Arab Emirates for solidarity that never really mattered, maybe it's time to expand the political horizons elsewhere.
And just to echo what you said earlier, but I was listening to the press conference with the so-called deal, and I counted actually, and if I'm not mistaken, Palestinians were only mentioned once by the UAE foreign minister, and so that's kind of the elephant in the room, is that, and just to basically to support what you said. This all has nothing to do with Palestinians. It's all about those states and their interests. The Palestinians are just a footnote in all of this. And I guess what I would ask is, I mean, how moving forward, how do, and frankly, Palestinians right now are underrepresented in terms of with the major powers. But how do we get to a point where the struggle of Palestinians is actually taken into consideration regarding the occupation and all of the other Israeli assaults on very basic Palestinian human rights?
Is this question for me, Muhammad?
I guess for you or for anybody.
Well, maybe just quickly, I'd like to touch on two very quick things. Number one, let's not mix between, or rather let's differentiate between United Arab Emirates as a government and the United Arab Emirates as a people. And the same thing applies to all Arab nations.
Oh yeah, of course, of course.
Because, in 2018, for example, there was one of the largest public opinion polls conducted in the Arab world in which all Arabs were asked the question, what is the greatest threat? And remember, this is happening 7 years into turmoils and revolutions and massacres that happening as part of the upheaval in the Middle East. And yet 91% of all Arabs determined that Israel remains the greatest threat of Arabs, and 77% of all Arabs, and maybe it's a little bit actually lower than expected, 77% of all Arabs, including Saudis, Emiratis, Bahrainis, and so forth, thought that Palestine remains the first and foremost cause of the Arab nations. So I think this is very important. Regarding your other points, and again, very quickly so, I think one of the biggest mistakes that the Palestinian leadership has committed throughout the years, but specifically since 1993, is that it abandoned its position as a leadership of a national liberation movement and embraced a whole new title and a whole new position, and that of being a state actor. National liberation movements are not state actors. State actors have to look at geopolitical leverage. They have something to offer in order for them to be part of this leverage. They have nothing. The only thing that Palestinians have at the moment, neither our oil nor our financial banking powers or any of that sort, we have our resistance. We resist, we exist, we don't resist, we don't matter to anybody. Yet for all of these years, for nearly 40 years now, we have all been pretending that we are an actual state. We have a president, we have ministers, we have a government, we have a budget. When we go on foreign visits, they put red carpets in front of our officials. We have a team in FIFA, in the World Cup. We are part of all the state, of the state apparatus, except of one little thing, and it's a very important thing, is that we have no sovereignty on the ground. Now, will the Palestinian Authority, and this is in my opinion far more important than unity between Hamas and Fatah and all of this, it's the way that the Palestinian Authority sees itself, or the Palestinian leadership sees itself. Will they continue to pretend that they are a state and therefore they are a state actor, or will they shift into something else, and that is leadership of resistance happening within Palestine itself? Whatever form of resistance, that's not my point at the moment. Are they a leadership of a national liberation struggle, or are they continuing to play this weird game and put on different hats, pretending to be something that they are not? And if they carry on with that, I think regardless of who else will normalize or does not normalize, I think the Palestinian cause will continue to suffer as a result.
And since you mentioned the divide, we do have a question online, and the question is, how does the Hamas-Fatah division fit into all of this, and Hamas's connection to the countries who support the Muslim Brotherhood?
Yes. Go ahead.
No, go right ahead. But I thought that Dr. Parsi should take a crack at this.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I'll let you answer the question regarding Fatah and Hamas. We're going into territories that I will claim absolutely zero leadership or expertise on. But let me say one thing. Even in the conversation that I heard just recently now, in regards to stop looking at the Arab world and start looking at Africa, Southeast Asia, Latin America, areas where sympathy with the Palestinians have been quite extensive, it still seems to me to stop one step too short, which is that the Palestinian cause, going back to the 1950s and 60s, became the cause célèbre of Arab nationalism that essentially died with the invasion of Kuwait by Saddam Hussein.
Yes.
But nevertheless, is still viewed and defined and framed oftentimes by Palestinians as an Arab cause. I think this has historical justification and understanding, but it may also impose on the cause significant limitations. that is going to be limiting its ability to be able to connect the issue to other energies that are out there. Right now, I find it quite fascinating. I teach classes on the geopolitics of the Middle East at Georgetown, and just seeing the shift of the students' perceptions and ideas about this issue over the course of the last 10 years is quite fascinating. The frame that always was the predominant one in the United States was to view this from the lens of terrorism, which is what has been the preference of the Israelis. Now, increasingly, you're seeing, partly because of the BDS movement, but even beyond, not just in the last year, that this is seen as framed as an issue of racial justice. Such a framing suddenly has a completely different potency when it comes to connecting with civil rights organizations and NGOs and non-state organizations throughout the Western world, particularly in the United States. But that requires more than a geographical reorientation of where to look for support. It requires also a fundamental rethink of how this whole issue is framed as a whole.
Okay, let me just carry on with that question, actually, that was posed by one of the listeners. I want to ask, should we be so dismissive of this normalization, or we have to look at it also from the Israeli point of view? Because Israel looks at normalization from, in my view, from a different perspective than, let's say, these Arab countries. They see it as legitimizing its not only its existence, but its existence as an occupying power, doing what it does, annexations and so on, while the Palestinians are getting more and more marginalized. So it is not such a, something that the Palestinians can dismiss, because they are, and going back to the first question that I asked, are they becoming more isolated while Israel is getting legitimized and its occupation legitimized?
Right. Yes. So, of course, I mean, clearly we can't dismiss this. It is very important, and it's, just the emotional impact. If I am to borrow from Antonio Gramsci's take on feelings and emotions in politics, just imagine the emotional impact on a whole generation or two or three of Arabs who are now witnessing this love fest that's going on between Arab officials and Israel. The fact that the United Arab Emirates is going to invest financially in an Israeli football team, Bitar Jerusalem, that is known of its utter and absolute racism. And we Palestinians have been lobbying with FIFA for such a long time to actually sanction this racist Israeli team. And now they are going to be a subject of Arab money investing in them. The whole thing is so bizarre. And I just feel really terrible for this generation of young Arabs who are witnessing this and just feeling so puzzled that their aspirations are just being crushed in such a way. But the question is, will it isolate Palestinians? Now, in order for us to answer that, we have to ask what Palestinians, which Palestinians? Will it isolate the Palestinian leadership and Palestinian Authority? I think so. Do I care personally? Not really, because I think the Palestinian Authority is the one that isolated itself. It chose to be part of the camp of moderates, and we have written about this for ages. And we have told them that this is a bad investment. You are being used. Your existence within this camp of moderates that the US has invented has a specific political purpose for the United States and others, and that is to de-alienate and to separate between the radicals and the extremists and the terrorists and the moderates. They got paid very handsomely, by the way. Billions of dollars of international donors' money made it to Ramallah and elsewhere and made some rich people a whole lot richer. Now, it's that group that is going to get isolated. Will the Palestinian people feel isolated? I have been touring and speaking about Palestine for 25 years, and I have never felt that that we live in better times as a Palestinian cause as we do right now. From New Zealand to Hawaii to Australia to South Africa to Kenya to Canada to Chile and elsewhere, the idea of Palestine, thanks to the work of numerous number of activists, intellectuals, starting with the generation of Edward Said, Ibrahim Abu-Lughod and others, we have actually managed to master the art of intersectionality. where we do not go as was discussed earlier. We are not just seeking Arab nationalist support. We are seeing the kind of support that is relatable by every human being in every part of the world. And thanks to the BDS platform that was created for us, now the cause of Palestine is quite popular. And I think it's really, really quite interesting that you have this shift, this massive shift that is happening worldwide, where Palestine is more popular, say, in Chile and South Africa than it is with the leaders of Bahrain and the United Arab Emirates. And one last thing I'd like to say, to prove that we as Palestinians are not actually, as a Palestinian people, are by no stretch of the imagination being isolated, is that you have the president of Luxembourg chastising the leaders in a tweet, the leaders of the United Arab Emirates, saying that you have betrayed your Arab people. And I thought that was quite a thing. I mean, it says so much that the president of Luxembourg is actually calling out Arabs for betraying their Arab cause. I think we have a massive paradigm shift in terms of the way that Palestine is being thought and perceived worldwide. And of course, we can't forget this growing affinity between Palestinians and the Black Lives Matter movement that we're actually able to now notice among ordinary people, not just intellectuals and the intellectual elites, but even ordinary people in the street. And I think that that is a huge opportunity that we should absolutely capitalize on.
I have a question for Dr. Parsi. Why, in your opinion, the suffering of the Palestinians, or this horrendous, stark occupation that Israel has conducted against the Palestinians for decades and decades, is not is sort of dismissed, or they're not being sensitive? I'm talking about American intellectuals, except for maybe with a few exceptions. Why is this issue not, enthralling American intellectuals to take side as Jewish intellectuals, American Jewish intellectuals, and so on? Why is that, in your opinion?
Well, I would actually say, I think in the course of the last 10, 15 years, it has. It's really fascinating. Just compare the atmosphere now to 2009, when I think there was one teenage celebrity that tweeted "Viva Palestina" during the Gaza bombings, and the backlash that person faced compared to what is happening right now. I think at the geopolitical level, at the state level, the decisions are being made, but on the ground, movements are moving in a very, very different direction. And those trends seems to be underpinned by factors that are not fleeting. There are not factors that will easily shift back. On the contrary, I think the trend is quite clear. But at some point, these sentiments need to be able to be captured politically, to be able to translate into something. Otherwise, it will be a scenario in which a lot of sympathy will be coming, but sympathy will not create a state. Sympathy will not create justice. Sympathy will not end occupation. Something much more than that is needed. And that's where the intersectionality comes into play, because we're talking about entities and movement that actually are organized, and as a result of that organization have political power. Mm-hmm. That is clearly something, having worked on Capitol Hill, it's, to be completely frank, when there's a major issue about Israel-Palestine, you have major pro-Israeli Jewish organizations on this side, and then you have major Jewish organizations on the other side. The Palestinians or Arab organizations are there, but they're not there in the manner that they could be and that they should be if they want to have that level of influence.
Mm-hmm. I guess with some organizations, major organizations being more major than others. But I want to follow on this point, Dr. Parsi, and to Dr. Baroud. I'd like him to take it as well. But what we have seen, let's say I'm old enough, and we are all, I guess, to remember, not Muhammad, to remember what was happening during the last years of the South African apartheid system. I mean, it was the support, not only in terms, not sympathy, but also actual tangible support, especially on college campuses throughout the U.S. Go ahead. Dr. Parsi?
Oh, sorry, I thought that the question was directed to.
Yeah, and Dr. Baroud will also respond to this.
Yeah, this is where I think, part of the reason why the BDS movement has created such fear in the Likud part of the Israeli government is precisely this. At the end of the day, sanctions and that type of a ground movement is highly dangerous precisely because of its ability to delegitimize not necessarily the state as a whole, but certain political activities, in this case, the occupation. The organizations in favor of the Likud government have been quite effective eliminating those type of sentiments at the political level, but organizing it on the ground level was something that was, much less resistance to, and seeing almost a panic level about that, I think is reflective of the power that can have. But for that to be successful, etc., I would assume it would have to be framed differently than just being an Arab cause. Creating that intersectionality, looking at it from a civil rights perspective, looking at it from a racial justice perspective, things of that nature. That is certainly what existed back in the days when it came to South Africa and the resistance back then. The South Africans never defined it as an African cause and an African cause alone. They went far beyond that. And I think new generation, new leadership, we're already seeing that happening. And that is quite fascinating. Again, as I mentioned earlier on, I'm not seeing any reason as to why those trends would not continue. On the contrary, every data point I see only seems to indicate that those trends are going to become stronger going forward. And in some ways, mindful of the fact that this is a deal that was struck by a highly unpopular Israeli prime minister on the American left. I'm talking about, even centrist Democrats. Secondly, by an American president that has the lowest international favorability and approval rating in history. By a UAE government that increasingly is being criticized for human rights abuses and because of its war crimes in Yemen and elsewhere. We're not talking about any entity there being able to legitimize the other one. They're all suffering tremendously in many different places, perception-wise, on their lack of legitimacy. And as a result, for them to come forward with a movement like this can, in the end, actually backfire quite extensively.
Dr. Baroud?
When you asked that question, I thought about an interview that I conducted yesterday with Professor Richard Falk. About his books and about his work at the United Nations. And
I know.
he said something really interesting that I kind of, it takes someone who actually very much involved with an institution like the UN to kind of reach that realization. He said that there are two types of politics at the United Nations: substantive politics, geopolitical politics, practical, tangible things that are happening every day on the ground, and there's moral politics. And so my question was, well, does moral politics ever prevail? He said, yes, in the long term, it does. It almost always does. And he gave the South Africa example that at one point in the past, it seems that the apartheid government had its geopolitical situation sorted out so very well. It was strong, it was solid, but it did not have a strong claim over morality whatsoever, obviously. I don't think anyone would agree to it at this point. And that's what really happens over the course of years, is that the morality of an issue so very slowly starts eating up at the power of a state or an entity and eventually demolishes it. The same way that the civil rights campaign in this country in the 60s managed to achieve to some large degree a paradigm shift. Of course, not enough to change everything, but certainly demolished all ideas and all traditions. The same thing happened in South Africa, and it happened in other parts of the world. So I think really the real fight here, and the fight is in the United States, I think it's kind of part and parcel of it, is that we need to continue pushing for the moral politics, thinking of politics in terms of ethics, in terms of human rights, reaching out to every man and woman on the street, because eventually they represent and influence this generation and coming generations. I think it's really quite interesting. You know, we all remember the book, They Dare to Speak Out, about these few people in Washington, D.C. who spoke out against Israel, and they paid quite a heavy price for it. I don't think that kind of narrative would fly today. You have very strong, solid congressmen and women who are pushing with a clear anti-Israeli occupation agenda, and they are moving from one strength to the next. When you have someone like Congresswoman McCallum, for example, pushing for the respect of Palestinian human rights and the human rights of Palestinian children and prisoners, these kind of topics would have never been entertained in the 80s and 90s. Now they are part of the conversation. I know we are still very early on in the process, but I really do believe that the future is ours. And I think Israel might have won the battle of substantive politics, but is and will completely eventually lose the battle of moral and ethical politics.
Thank you, Dr. Baroud. And we do have another question that was asked earlier on. And this is for both of you to answer, but the question is, Dr. Baroud, you mentioned that the pivot to Asia and the increasing role of Turkey and Russia, and what are the implications of increasing Chinese involvement in the Middle East, which is now apparently might be the biggest buyer of Saudi oil, etc. So to both of you, what do you see? How do you look at that?
Dr. Parsi, would you like to take this question?
Sure. I think if you take a look at how the Chinese have been approaching the Middle East, they've been going in it very carefully. They have, unlike the United States, no interest whatsoever to entangle themselves in any of the region's conflicts. They like to trade, they like to buy, they want to move millions of their own people out of poverty, they want to create new markets, but they have little to no interest in taking a side in favor of the Israelis or in favor of the Palestinians, in favor of the Iranians, or in favor of the Saudis. And to the longest period possible, they will try to maintain that balancing act. So the idea that some state would perhaps rely on the Chinese as a balancer against the US on a specific issue, I think is a bit of wishful thinking. That is not how the Chinese are going to allow themselves to be played. They want to be there, they want to trade, but they have neither any interest nor political incentives, nor a political system that allows for these type of issues to be pushed for within their own political system. You can see that quite clearly when it comes to the Iranians, for instance. For quite some time, they were hoping that China would become some sort of a counterweight to the US. Now we're seeing movement on that front, but just as much as headlines have been made about a 25-year agreement between the Iranians and the Chinese, let's not forget the Chinese already have their own 25 agreement with the Saudis. Keeping that balance to the longest possible is what they're going to be pursuing there. So while China's entry as a great power at some point will strengthen an already existing trend of moving towards multipolarity, that does not necessarily mean that the Chinese are going to eagerly walk into conflicts and try to have a Cold War with the US, and whatever issue the US is taking here, they will take the opposite. Their calculation is a much wiser one from their own perspective, which is fights that are not theirs, they're not going to unnecessarily involve themselves with, which is quite the opposite of the approach the US has taken. Pax Americana in the region, to a very large extent, has led to the United States being a belligerent in almost all of these conflicts rather than being a balancer. That has bled the United States extensively. It is much weaker as a result of it. The population is extremely tired of wars. The Chinese are looking at this, and I'm pretty confident they will do everything they can not to copy the American strategy.
Thank you. And I was wondering if we can you both offer some closing comments regarding this issue?
Yeah, absolutely. Do you mind, Dr. Parsi, if I take this very quickly?
Yes, absolutely.
I think there is something positive that can come out of this. And that is, the fact that we have this clarity. One of the worst things that you struggle with in politics or political analysis is we don't have clarity. Someone is posing to be a friend and he is actually an enemy. Someone who is pretending to be on your side, but he's actually stabbing you in the back. And I think we might have been entering a new phase of politics in the Middle East, and that is the phase of political clarity, where you would know the enemy and you would know the friend. And I think that's for the Palestinian leadership. If it manages to unify its rank, of course, this could be a great opportunity to build a whole new type of alliances with that clarity in mind. Just very quickly, you mentioned the Hamas Fatah, and I'd like to finish with that. For a long time, we've been thinking of unity among Hamas and Fatah in the wrong way, or among Palestinian factions in the wrong way. Let's remember that the push for unity between Hamas and Fatah actually was not necessarily a Palestinian demand, a collective Palestinian demand. It was rather an American-Israeli excuse of why we can't negotiate with the Palestinians because we don't have a peace partner. Netanyahu said that so very repeatedly. Palestinians are fighting amongst each other, and you tell us achieve peace. Peace with whom? Hamas, Fatah? We have no idea who represents the Palestinians. And therefore, there was this kind of push from so many parties, from Yemen to Saudi Arabia to Egypt to Moscow to the US to Britain to everybody else, to bring unity between Fatah and Hamas so that there is one unified Palestinian voice. I don't think that really matters a great deal. What really matters is that unity among Palestinians around certain set of values, principles. What type of struggle do we want to use? What kind of objectives? What kind of a vision do we have as a people? Are we going to continue chasing after a two-state solution, knowing full well it will never under any circumstance actualize? Or will we ask and demand and fight and struggle for equality within one state between Arabs and Jews? So I think what we are really looking at here is the ball, in my opinion, is in the Palestinian camp. I am far more interested in what the Palestinians are about to do right now. What piece are they going to move? What action are they going to take to counterbalance what Israel is doing in terms of normalization in the region? And if we fail to do so, I am sad to say that we have no one else to blame but ourselves.
Dr. Parsi.
Thank you. I think what Dr. Baroud said is in many ways quite correct. There is a geopolitical layer above all of this that can be quite complicating for what you mentioned. If we take a look at what has happened in the last 20 years, from the invasion of Iraq to the Arab Spring to the civil war in Syria, in many ways, all of these geopolitical events, particularly the latter ones, have served to deprioritize the Palestinian cause internationally as well as regionally. We are right now at the cusp of a moment in which a new geopolitical constellation appears to be forming between some of these countries that want the US to stay in the region and as a result are moving forward with some form of either a cold or a hot war with Iran, potentially Turkey as part of the some form of not an alliance, but some partnership with Iranians. If that were to happen, that is also likely going to be one of these geopolitical events that once again will push aside the Palestinian issue, both internationally and certainly regionally. And that is also something that needs to be factored in any calculation about how the struggle for the Palestinian people's rights will continue.
Okay.
Well, I would like to first of all thank you both, Dr. Baroud and Dr. Parsi, and of course our moderator, Mr. Arakat. Thank you so much. Thanks for the analyses. We really appreciate it, and thank you also for everybody that is watching. And we look forward to having you all together soon. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.